I've been farming this land for almost 20 years. Out here, just outside of Valentine, Nebraska, it's quiet. Nothing but fields stretching as far as the eye can see. I've lived alone since my wife passed, and I don't mind it. The long hours, the isolation, the way the sky turns orange and pink in the evenings, it's all I need. But something happened last night. Something I can't explain. I woke up before dawn, same as always, rolled out of bed, stretched my aching back, and put on my boots. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I noticed something was wrong. The air smelled different, damp, but not from rain, almost metallic. I stood on the porch for a moment, trying to place it. Maybe the wind had carried in something from the river, I thought. Then I turned toward my field, and my stomach dropped. Every single cornstalk, acres upon acres, was gone. Not cut down, not trampled, just gone. The field was empty, flattened, like nothing had ever grown there. No broken stalks, no footprints, no sign of harvesting equipment. Just bare dirt stretching all the way to the tree line. I felt my breath hitch. This wasn't possible. I hurried down the porch steps, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The further I walked, the more wrong it felt. The soil was damp, but not with morning dew. It was darker, almost like it had been, soaked in something. I knelt down and ran my fingers through it. The dirt smelled rotten, like something had been festering beneath it for years. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. I had just walked through this field yesterday. The corn had been tall, almost ready for harvest. I would have needed at least 2 weeks to clear it all myself. But it was gone. All of it. I turned in circles, scanning the landscape for any sign of what happened. Maybe a storm? A tornado? But I would have heard that. And storms don't erase crops without leaving a trace. No broken stalks, no scattered leaves, just nothing. That's when I noticed something else. The woods at the edge of my property, where the field ended and the tree line began, looked different. The trees were darker, like they had been burned. But there was no fire, no ash, just blackened trunks stretching into the distance. And then I saw the footprints, leading out of the woods, right up to the edge of my field. They weren't human. The tracks were deep, pressed into the damp soil. Each print was massive, 3 times the size of my boot. Not a boot print, not a shoe. Bare, but with long, curved impressions where claws should be. I stared at them, my mind racing. No animal I knew left prints like that. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. And whatever it was, it had walked out of the trees, stopped at the edge of my field, and then disappeared. I should have turned back right then. Should have walked straight into my house, locked the door, and waited for the sun to rise. But instead, I took another step. And that's when I heard it. A low, wet breathing. Not from the field. From behind me. I didn't turn around right away. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get back inside, lock the door, pretend I hadn't seen any of this. But I knew better. Predators react to movement. I stayed still, listening. The breathing was slow, deliberate, wet, like something was struggling to pull air into lungs that didn't quite work right. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I swallowed hard. My shotgun was inside, leaning against the kitchen door frame. 10, maybe 15 yards away. I could make it if I sprinted. Then the breathing stopped. Silence stretched across the empty field, thicker than any fog. Even the usual morning sounds, crickets, birds, the rustling of leaves, were gone. The whole world held its breath. And then, behind me, I heard footsteps. Not heavy, not clumsy, slow, measured, like something that had been waiting a long time, taking its time now. I turned my head just an inch, enough to catch movement in my peripheral vision. Something tall, too tall. It stood at the edge of my property, where the grass met the dirt. The thing wasn't moving anymore, just standing there, watching. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look directly at it, but I had to. Slowly, I turned, and what I saw, it wasn't right. It was thin. Its body stretched upward like a tree stripped of its bark, limbs too long, skin the color of dead wood. I couldn't see its face, not at first, but I could feel its eyes locked onto me, and its hands. I swear to God, they were still dripping. I stumbled back. My boots skidded against the damp soil, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing twitched when I moved, just a small motion, like it was testing me. That's when I ran. I tore across the yard, my boots barely touching the ground. My lungs burned, my hands fumbled for the screen door. I slammed through it, grabbed my shotgun, spun back around. But it was gone. The field was empty. The tree line still loomed, blackened and wrong. The footprints in the dirt were still there. But the thing, whatever it was, had disappeared. I stood there, shotgun clutched in my hands, trying to slow my breathing. My body felt cold, like something had drained all the heat from my blood. I forced myself to move, to check the locks, to shut every curtain. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop until every door was bolted, every window covered. Then, for the first time in 20 years, I sat at my kitchen table, shotgun across my lap, and waited for sunrise. When the first light of morning hit my porch, I dared to look outside again. The field was still empty, but something had changed. At the edge of the woods, right where the thing had been standing, something had been left behind. A pile of rotting corn. Hundreds of ears, shriveled and blackened, stacked in a perfect mound. As if whatever had taken my field had decided to give some of it back. I didn't touch the corn. I didn't even go near it. The way it sat there, stacked too perfectly, too deliberately, made my skin crawl. I wasn't stupid enough to think it was some random animal that did it. No coyotes or deer were out there making offerings at the edge of my land. I thought about burning it. But something deep inside me, a part of me that had seen too many things in my years on this farm, told me that would be a mistake. Instead, I backed away, went inside, and picked up the phone. I called the sheriff. Valentine is a small town, and Sheriff Burroughs is one of those men who's seen just about everything there is to see out in these parts. I told him about my field, about the missing corn, about the footprints that didn't belong to anything I recognized. I left out the part about the thing I saw standing in the field. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to hear how crazy it sounded out loud. By the time Burroughs pulled up in his truck, I was waiting on the porch, shotgun still in hand. He stepped out, adjusted his belt, and gave me a look. "Well," he said, "let's have a look." I led him out to the field. His boots crunched against the dirt, the only sound in the dead silence of the morning. He didn't say much, just crouched down, ran his fingers through the darkened soil, then walked the perimeter, taking his time. When he got to the footprints, he stopped, stared. I saw his jaw tighten. "What do you think?" I asked, voice hoarse from a night without sleep. Burroughs didn't answer right away. He just took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, even though it wasn't hot, and let out a long breath. Then he pointed at the pile of corn. "You touch it?" "No." "Good," he muttered. That was the first real sign that something was wrong. Sheriff Burroughs isn't the kind of man to get rattled. But when he turned to me, his expression wasn't just concerned. It was something else. Like he'd seen this before. "You're going to want to stay inside tonight," he said finally. "Keep your doors locked, your lights on." That wasn't the answer I expected. I felt my stomach knot. What the hell does that mean? Burroughs didn't look at me when he spoke. He just kept staring out at the field, like he was trying to find something in the empty space. "Means whatever did this isn't done yet." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. I followed him. "That's it? That's all you're going to tell me?" He stopped at his door, finally meeting my eyes. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw something in the sheriff's face I'd never seen before. Fear. "You're not the first, James," he said quietly. "You won't be the last." Then he got in, started the engine, and drove off, leaving me standing in the dust, staring out at my ruined farm. I didn't know it yet, but by the time the sun set, I'd be fighting for my life. I spent the rest of the day preparing, though I wasn't sure for what. I fed the animals, locked the barn, triple-checked the doors and windows. My hands felt restless, like they needed something to do, so I cleaned my rifle, loaded it, and set it beside the shotgun by the front door. The air was heavy all afternoon, thick like it gets before a storm, but no clouds rolled in. The field sat empty, a vast stretch of bare soil that used to hold rows of my best crop. The pile of rotten corn at the tree line remained untouched. The wind shifted near dusk, carrying the same metallic scent I'd noticed that morning. The smell of something old, something decayed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the farm felt different. Not just empty, wrong. The quiet was absolute. No crickets, no birds, no rustling of the trees. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, like the whole world was holding its breath. I sat in the kitchen with the rifle across my lap, the back door in my line of sight, the windows covered. I had seen things on this land before, coyotes lurking at the edge of the woods, black bears sniffing around the chicken coop. But this was different. This wasn't an animal. The first sound came just past midnight. A scraping noise, distant but clear, carried on the still air. It wasn't at the house. It was out in the field, near where the corn had been, slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself across the soil. I forced myself to stay seated. The urge to look was strong, but I knew better. I tightened my grip on the rifle and focused on my breathing. Then came the second sound. A whispering. Not words, not even a voice exactly, but something close. It drifted through the walls, curling around the edges of the windows like smoke. It wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere, slipping under the doors, seeping in through the cracks. I felt something move outside. Not the sound of footsteps, but the presence of them. A shift in the air, like the weight of something heavy pressing down on the land. And then, the breathing. That same wet sound I had heard before, deeper now, more labored. It was closer this time, right outside. The door rattled. I went still, finger hovering over the trigger. The old wood shuddered in its frame, not from force, but from pressure, like something was testing it, feeling the grain, the weight of it. A slow, deliberate push. I held my breath. The thing outside moved away, but I didn't relax. The air was thick with it now, a presence that wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something else. And then, for the first time in 20 years, I heard a sound I had never heard before on this farm. Laughter. Not deep, not loud. Soft, brittle, like dry leaves crumbling underfoot. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to move, stepping to the nearest window, peeling the curtain back just an inch. The yard was empty, but the tree line wasn't. The shadows there weren't right. Too dark, too deep. Something moved among them, tall and thin, shifting just beyond the reach of the porch light. I could see the outline of it now, its head tilted, watching the house, watching me. And then it stepped forward. Not fast, not with hunger or violence, but with intent. It wanted me to see it. I dropped the curtain, heart hammering, forced myself to back away. The whispering grew louder, wrapping around the house in unseen threads. A low creak came from the front porch. Something was on the steps. I raised the rifle, aimed at the door, finger curling over the trigger. Another creak. The boards strained under a weight that shouldn't be there. The doorknob twisted. I fired. The gunshot tore through the silence, echoing into the night. The force of it shook the walls, sent dust drifting from the ceiling. But the moment the sound faded, the whispering stopped. Everything stopped. I stood there, rifle still raised, waiting for something to move. For the door to burst open, for the thing outside to push its way in. But nothing came. The night stretched on, still and waiting. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn bled into the sky. Then, finally, I dared to open the door. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. No footprints, no marks, except one. Carved into the wood of the porch, right below the doorframe, were 3 deep, jagged slashes. A warning, or a promise. Morning light didn't feel like safety. It barely felt real. The wind had shifted again, carrying the damp, rotting scent through the open fields. It clung to the walls of my house, to my skin. I could still hear the gunshot echoing in my skull, but there was nothing outside. No body, no blood. Just those 3 deep slashes carved into the wood. I should have left. Packed a bag, driven to town, told the sheriff that something was out here. But I knew what would happen. he'd give me that same tired look, the one men like him always give when they've already decided you're crazy. No evidence, no case, no case, no help. So I stayed. I worked through the day, fixing the porch boards where the scratches had gouged too deep. I walked the tree line, but never crossed it. The pile of rotten corn was still there, untouched. The dark soil in the field felt softer than before, like something had been moving beneath it. I tried not to think about that. As the sun dipped lower, that familiar silence crept back in, the kind that didn't feel natural. No birds, no wind, no distant calls of coyotes, just the weight of something unseen settling over the land. By the time I locked the doors and closed the curtains, the whispering had already started. It was closer this time, not outside in the fields, not at the tree line. It was near the house, circling it. The way it moved, it wasn't random. It was searching. And then, right against the window behind me, I heard it. A slow tap, tap, tap against the glass. I didn't turn around. It wanted me to look. The whispering shifted, turning to something else. A scraping noise against the siding, like nails dragging down the wood. The back door creaked as if something was testing it. I tightened my grip on the rifle, heart hammering, and then, for the first time, it spoke. Not loud, not even clear, but it was there, inside the whispering. Words stretched thin, distorted like a voice played backwards on an old tape. "Let me in." I stepped away from the window. The whispering swelled, wrapping around the house in twisting echoes. Something thumped against the back door. A dull, heavy knock. 1, 2, 3. My pulse pounded. I raised the rifle, aimed at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it didn't. Instead, the breathing started again. Low, wet, just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, all at once, it stopped. The air thinned, like a pressure lifting. The whispering faded into nothing. No footsteps retreating. No sound at all. Just stillness. I didn't sleep. Not until dawn came, dragging weak light over the land. And when I finally opened the door, the rotting corn was gone. But something else had been left in its place. A scarecrow. It hadn't been there yesterday. It stood right in the middle of my empty field, facing the house. A crude thing, just two wooden poles lashed together, dressed in old, tattered fabric. The head was a burlap sack stuffed with something lumpy. A black slit had been cut where a mouth should be. And across the chest, 3 deep slashes. The same ones carved into my porch. The same ones I'd seen in the dirt, like a signature or a message. Morning brought no comfort. The first thing I did was check the field. I almost didn't want to. My gut told me something had changed. The scarecrow was still there. But the moment I laid eyes on it, I knew something was different. The burlap sack that made up its head had shifted. The jagged mouth had stretched wider overnight. The slashes down its chest were deeper, the fabric curling at the edges like wounds that refused to close. And then there was the ground beneath it. It looked disturbed, no longer flat, but sunken in places, like something had been moving just under the soil. I kept my distance. The memory of last night was still fresh. The tapping on the window, the whispering, the knocking at my door. My hands were still shaking from it. I hadn't slept. Not really. I'd spent the night sitting in my chair with the rifle in my lap, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. It never did. But I had felt something there, on the other side. The weight of a presence. The way it seemed to press against the walls, slither between the cracks. Now, in the daylight, the silence felt even worse. Nothing moved. No wind. No insects. Not even a bird in the distance. Just the dry rustle of my boots against the dirt as I stepped forward. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe. Maybe something deeper. I stopped a few feet away from the scarecrow, close enough to see the details I hadn't noticed before. The fabric was stained, not just with dirt. Something darker. Something dried into the burlap. The smell that rose from it wasn't right. It wasn't just the scent of damp cloth or old wood. It was earthy, but not in a natural way, like the inside of something that had been buried too long. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. But as I turned to leave, my foot caught on something hard beneath the soil. I stumbled, steadied myself, then crouched down. There was something just below the surface. I hesitated, then reached down, brushing away the loose dirt. My breath caught. It was bone, not just a fragment, a whole hand. The fingers curled like they had been clawing at the surface, trying to get free. A human hand. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had been standing next to a grave. No, not a grave. A burial. Because whoever had been under there hadn't been laid to rest. They had been put there. I turned on my heel and walked away, fast, nearly tripping over my own feet. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I locked the doors behind me, shutting every curtain in the house, as if that would do anything. It had been buried in my field, and last night, it had come to my door. I sat at the kitchen table, rifle across my lap, trying to steady my breathing. The farmhouse was quiet, but not in the way it should be. It was a forced quiet, the kind that settles when something is listening. The bones. I had seen them, touched them. They were real. Who, or what, had been buried there? And why had it been dug up? No, not dug up. It had crawled out. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. I needed to think, to understand. But my mind kept circling back to the same truth. This thing, whatever had taken my corn, whatever had left the whispers and the marks on my door, it had been under my feet all along. And last night, it had come back. Outside, the wind had picked up. A slow, uneasy shift through the empty field. The scarecrow still stood there, but it looked worse. The burlap sack had slumped forward, the open mouth gaping wider. The fabric at its chest was torn, no longer just slashed, but split down the middle. The arms sagged like something had grabbed hold of them and pulled. I swallowed hard. I needed help. I reached for the phone, but before my fingers touched it, I stopped. What was I going to say? "Sheriff, there's something in my field." It whispers at night and leaves handprints on my windows. I found a body. No, just the bones. And now it's walking around. I already knew how that would go. Burroughs would drive out here, take one look at the empty field, and tell me to get some rest. And the moment he left, night would fall again. No, no one was coming to help me. I was on my own. I needed to know more. Digging deeper. I forced myself to go outside. The wind was steady, dry, carrying the scent of damp earth and something stale. The sky had turned overcast, the clouds thick and unmoving. I stepped toward the field, my boots sinking slightly into the dirt. The hole where I'd uncovered the bones was still there, a shallow dip in the soil. But there was something else now. A trail. The disturbed earth stretched away from the hole, a broken, uneven path leading toward the tree line. The footprints weren't clear, more like drag marks, like something had crawled its way out. I followed. Every step made my stomach tighten. The soil felt wrong beneath my feet, too soft in some places, compacted in others. It was like the ground had been turned over more than once. The trail led me to the edge of the woods. The trees were dark, their trunks stripped bare in places, bark curling at the edges as if something had peeled it away. The air was colder here, the wind barely touching the leaves above. And then I saw it. Another hole. Not fresh, but deep. Like someone had dug, then abandoned it. A pit. The soil around it had collapsed slightly, revealing layers beneath. Not just dirt, but fabric. I crouched, heart hammering. Slowly, I reached forward, brushing the dirt aside. The fabric was stiff, old, rotting burlap. The same material as the scarecrow. I kept digging. My fingers scraped something hard. I swallowed, dug deeper, and uncovered the shape beneath. A second skull, smaller than the first. A child's skull. My breath caught in my throat. Something crunched in the trees behind me. I froze. The wind had stopped completely. The branches were still, but something was there, watching. I turned, slowly, my heart slamming against my ribs. The field behind me was empty, but the scarecrow wasn't in the same place. I stared. It had moved. Not far, just a few feet. But I knew. I knew where it had been standing before. The slumped head, the outstretched arms, the open, gaping mouth. It was looking at me now. I stepped back, stumbling slightly. My boot caught the edge of the pit, and I nearly fell. The skull shifted in the dirt, rolling slightly, the hollow socket staring up at me. And then, the whispering began again. Not around the house this time. Behind me, in the woods. Low and distant, just like before. But now, it was getting closer. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from one place. It was moving, slipping through the trees, circling me. The same voice I had heard before, stretched thin, layered with something beneath it. Something older. The skull in the dirt seemed to watch me. I stepped back, but the whispering followed. My breath came quick and uneven as I scanned the woods. There was nothing there, but I could feel it. A weight in the air, thick and pressing, wrapping around me like unseen hands. The trail of disturbed earth stretched from the grave, leading into the trees. Whatever had been buried there hadn't stayed. It had crawled out. And now it was waiting. I took another step back. A branch snapped somewhere to my left. The whispering thinned for just a second, like whatever was speaking had stopped to listen too. Then it started again. "You found it." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They slipped under my skin like splinters, curling into the space behind my ribs. "You dug it up." I turned and ran. My boots slammed against the dirt as I tore across the open field. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't want to see. The whispering didn't follow, but I could feel it watching. The farmhouse came into view, a dark shape against the gray sky. I hit the porch at full speed, nearly tripping over the steps in my panic. My hands fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat, shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the hole. I got inside. I slammed the door, locked it. Silence. I pressed my back against the wood, chest heaving. The house felt cold. The air was different inside now, thicker, like the whispering had left something behind. I reached for the light switch, flicked it on. Nothing. The power was out. A deep, shuddering breath forced its way from my throat. I didn't remember the lights going out. They had been on when I left. I grabbed the shotgun off the table, checked the shells, then backed away from the door. My boots scraped against the hardwood as I moved toward the kitchen. The lanterns were in the cabinet. If I could just... Knock. I froze. A slow, deliberate knock against the front door. I swallowed hard, gripped the shotgun tighter. Knock, knock, knock. Not urgent, not rushed. Just patient. The whispering was gone now. The house was silent except for the soft, steady knocking. I didn't move. Something shifted outside. A soft scrape of fabric against wood. Then, "Let me in." The voice was right outside the door. It wasn't the whispering now. It wasn't distant. It was there. My heart slammed against my ribs. I raised the shotgun, aiming at the door, knowing it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. Another knock. Then another. And then it laughed. A dry, brittle sound, like wind through dead leaves. It wasn't loud, but it sank into my skin like rot. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The laughter faded. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence lifted. The air thinned. The weight pressing down on my chest eased. The whispering didn't return. I stood there, shotgun still raised, waiting. Silence. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, footsteps, soft, slow, moving away from the house. I stayed frozen, my back pressed against the wall, waiting for something to change. But the footsteps faded into nothing. It was gone. Or at least, it wanted me to think it was. I stayed awake until dawn, the gun never leaving my hands. When the first pale light of morning touched the land, I forced myself to step outside. The sky was dull, overcast. The air smelled damp, heavy with something stale. The field stretched empty before me. Except the scarecrow was gone. The ground where it had stood was dug up. The soil had been churned, torn apart by something that had crawled free. And leading from that spot, stretching toward the house, were deep, sunken footprints. The same ones I had seen at the tree line. The same ones that had led to my door. Morning brought no comfort. The footprints stretched across the field, leading from where the scarecrow had stood to the steps of my porch. Deep impressions in the damp soil, too large for a man, too deliberate for an animal. The sight of them made my skin crawl. The thing hadn't just come to my door. It had stood there, waiting. The whispering from the night before still echoed in my head. "Let me in." I gritted my teeth and forced myself forward. My boots crunched against the dirt as I walked the length of the tracks, heart pounding with every step. The ground felt wrong beneath me, loose in places where it shouldn't be. When I reached the spot where the scarecrow had been, I stopped. The soil was dark, overturned like a grave had been dug and then emptied. I clenched my fists. This had been buried here. For how long? And why had it come back now? A sound carried on the wind. A distant creak. I turned toward the barn. The doors hung open slightly, swaying with the breeze. I was sure I had locked them the night before. I didn't want to go inside. Everything in me screamed not to. But I had to know. I moved forward, shotgun steady in my grip, my pulse hammering. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became. Damp earth, old wood, something else, something rotting. I swallowed down the bile rising in my throat and stepped inside. The barn was still. Dust floated in the beams of gray morning light cutting through the slats. The horses shifted in their stalls, ears twitching, eyes wide. They were scared. They had been scared all night. Something had been in here with them. I moved slowly, eyes scanning the dark corners, the rafters above. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. I could feel it. A wrongness settled in the air, thick and cloying. Then I saw it. Against the farthest wall, just beyond the reach of the light, something had been carved into the wood. I stepped closer, stomach twisting. 3 deep, jagged slashes. The same ones I had seen on my porch. The same ones on the scarecrow. A warning, or a mark. I raised a shaking hand, traced my fingers along the grooves. The edges were fresh. The cuts ran deep, splintering the wood as if something had dragged claws through it. My throat went dry. The thing had been here. It had left its mark, just like it had on my house. I turned on my heel, moving fast. My boots hit the dirt hard as I stepped out into the open air, gulping it down like I had been drowning inside. The clouds above were darker now, heavy. The wind had picked up, sending a slow ripple through the empty field. I needed to leave. I needed to get in my truck, drive as far as I could, and never come back. But I couldn't. This was my land, and whatever had come back to it, it wasn't finished. I stormed inside, grabbed my keys, but the moment I touched them, I hesitated. A thought slithered its way into my mind. Would it even let me leave? The idea sent a chill down my spine. What if I started the truck and the road just didn't end? What if I drove for miles and somehow I was still here? What if I never made it out at all? I stood there, frozen in place. The weight of the house pressed in around me, The wind outside howled against the windows. And then, tap. I went rigid. The sound came from the back door. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, not frantic, just gentle, like fingers brushing against the glass. I swallowed, forcing myself to turn my head. The curtains were drawn. I couldn't see outside. But something was there, waiting, listening. Then, a whisper. Not outside the door this time. Inside the house. Right behind me. "It's almost time." The voice sent ice through my veins. I spun around, shotgun raised, but there was nothing there. Just the empty kitchen, the cold air, and the soft creak of a floorboard down the hall. I wasn't alone anymore. It had finally come inside. The whispering was inside. It curled through the walls, slipping through the cracks in the wood, creeping under the doors like mist. It was everywhere, pressing in, thick as a swarm of insects humming in the dark. I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen in the kitchen, shotgun locked in my grip, my back pressed against the counter. The whispering wasn't coming from the windows anymore. It wasn't outside, waiting at the door. It was inside the house. I heard it move. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. My pulse pounded in my skull. I tightened my hold on the shotgun, swallowing the rising bile in my throat. Then, silence. A presence settled in the hallway, just beyond the doorway. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A weight in the air, thick and oppressive, sinking into my bones like damp rot. Then, from the dark, tap. A soft knock. Not at the front door, not at the back door. At the hallway wall. Close. Too close. Another tap. Slow. Gentle. Like fingers against wood. I forced my breathing to slow. I had to think. I had to move. But my body wouldn't listen. The whispering curled around my ears, spilling from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was layered now, more than one voice. "You let me in." The words didn't come from the hallway. They came from behind me. A breath of ice curled against my neck. I spun, shotgun raised. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The dim glow of the lantern flickered against the walls, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I swallowed hard, chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. I turned back toward the hallway, and it was standing there. The thing from the field. No, not a thing. A man. Or at least something that had once been a man. It loomed just beyond the threshold, too tall for the house, its limbs stretched thin and unnatural. The burlap sack that covered its head sagged forward, the jagged slit where its mouth should be stretching wide. I couldn't see its eyes. I didn't want to see them. It took a step forward. The wooden boards groaned under its weight, but the rest of the house was still. The whispering had stopped. I wanted to run, wanted to tear through the door and never look back. But I was trapped. The thing lifted its head, and then it smiled. The jagged slit in the burlap twisted upward, widening. The fabric ripped. I saw its teeth. Not human. Not right. A row of jagged, splintered bone lined the inside of its mouth, as if something had tried to chew its way out from within. I lifted the shotgun, finger tightening over the trigger. It took another step. "It's almost time." The words didn't come from its mouth. They came from the walls. The whispering exploded back into the air, rising to a deafening pitch. The house shook. The lantern flickered wildly, the shadows crawling up the walls like fingers reaching for me. The thing moved faster. It crossed the kitchen in a heartbeat, long arms stretching forward. I fired. The shotgun roared, the blast lighting up the room for a fraction of a second. The force sent me stumbling back, the stock slamming into my shoulder. The thing didn't fall. The smoke cleared. The whispering stopped. The house fell silent. I stood there, panting, gun still raised. My ears rang from the shot. And then it laughed. Soft, dry. The sound of wind through dead leaves. I saw its mouth move. I heard the laughter slip out. But its chest didn't rise. It wasn't breathing. I took a step back. My boot scuffed against the floor. The thing twitched. Then it lunged. I threw myself backward as the skeletal fingers reached for me. I ran. Out of the kitchen, through the hallway, toward the front door. The house groaned around me, the wood splitting, the walls peeling away like old flesh. The whispering was inside my head now. "Don't leave. You waited for me. You should stay." The door. I hit it hard, shoulder slamming into the wood, hand fumbling for the lock. The whispering turned to screaming. Something grabbed my wrist. Cold. Thin. Too many fingers. I ripped away. The lock turned. The door flew open. I stumbled forward, landing hard on my hands and knees. My breath hitched. Silence. I looked up. The field was empty. The trees. The barn. The footprints. Gone. The house behind me stood still, quiet, untouched, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I forced myself to my feet. The morning sun was pushing through the clouds now, weak and colorless. The wind had died. A trick. A lie. I turned back to the door. The scratches were still there. The marks. The warning. I took one last look at the empty field, and I left. I never went back. I don't know what happened to the farm after that. I don't want to know. All I know is that something was buried there, something that should have stayed buried. And when it came back, it wanted me to stay. But I didn't. I ran. And even now, years later, in another town, another home, I still hear it, the whispering, waiting, calling me back. And I know one day I'll have to answer.